Racist teacher sets fire to black girl's braids. Not knowing her dad is the school owner. A shocking incident in the classroom sets off a chain of events that will forever change the teacher's life when the girl's father steps in. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The art classroom buzzed with the usual afternoon energy as students arranged their supplies on wooden tables. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air. Layla sat at her desk, her intricate box braids catching the light as she bent over her sketchbook, adding careful details to her latest drawing. Professor Margaret Williams moved between the desks, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor as she observed her students' work. She stopped behind several students, offering brief comments in her clipped tone. When she reached Layla's desk, she paused longer than usual. "Miss Thompson," Margaret said, her voice carrying across the now quiet classroom. "Your technique shows promise, but I must address something that's been bothering me." She gestured toward Layla's braids with a manicured hand. "These elaborate hairstyles you insist on wearing, they're rather distracting. Not particularly artistic. Wouldn't you agree?" The room fell silent. 23 students stopped working, their heads turning toward Layla's desk. Jason Chun, sitting 2 seats away, dropped his pencil. It clattered against the floor, the sound sharp in the tense atmosphere. Layla's hands tightened around her pencil. "My braids are artistic," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. "They're part of my culture and identity." Margaret's lips thinned into a tight line. "Culture is one thing, but this is an art class. We focus on true artistic expression here." She reached for the electric candle on her desk, a prop she often used for still life demonstrations. Perhaps a practical lesson would help you understand. Before anyone could react, Margaret flicked on the battery-operated candle and moved it closer to Layla's head. The plastic flame touched one of her braids. Layla's scream pierced the air. She jumped up, knocking her chair backward. It crashed to the floor as she clutched at her hair, the acrid smell of burnt synthetic hair filling the classroom. "What the hell?" Dylan Martinez stood up from his seat near the window. "You can't do that." Chairs scraped against the floor as other students rose in protest. Sarah Johnson, Layla's best friend, rushed to her side. "Are you okay?" "Let me see. This is assault." Michael Thompson, no relation to Layla, shouted from the back of the room. He already had his phone out, recording the aftermath. Tears streamed down Layla's face, but they weren't just from pain. The humiliation burned hotter than her scalp as she looked at her classmates' shocked faces. Margaret stood frozen, the candle still in her hand, her expression a mix of superiority and growing uncertainty as she realized the gravity of her actions. "You're crazy," Emma Rodriguez said, stepping between Layla and Margaret. Other students followed, forming a protective circle around their classmate. Layla couldn't stay there, not with everyone staring, not with the smell of her burnt hair filling her nostrils, not with Margaret's satisfied smirk still visible behind the wall of students. She grabbed her backpack and ran. Her footsteps echoed through the empty hallway as she pushed through the heavy double doors. Behind her, she could hear multiple sets of feet following, her classmates calling her name. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The afternoon sun hit her face as she burst out of the building, her chest heaving with sobs she could no longer contain. Her fingers found the damaged braid, the texture rough and brittle where the artificial flame had touched it. Each breath brought fresh tears as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Jamal Thompson sat in his office reviewing quarterly budget reports when his cell phone buzzed. The school's number flashed on the screen. His stomach tightened. Midday calls from school rarely brought good news. "Mr. Thompson speaking," he answered, already standing up from his desk. "Mr. Thompson, this is Vice Principal Chun." The administrator's voice was carefully controlled. "There's been an incident involving Layla in her art class. We need you to come to the school immediately." "What kind of incident?" Jamal's grip tightened on the phone. The pause before Chin's response made his heart rate spike. "Professor Williams had an altercation with Layla. Your daughter is physically unharmed." "But physically unharmed? What exactly happened to my daughter?" Jamal was already grabbing his car keys, his voice rising with each word. "Sir, I think it's best we discuss this in person. Layla is safe, but understandably upset. She's with the school counselor now." Jamal ended the call without saying goodbye. As he hurried through the parking lot, dozens of scenarios played through his mind, each worse than the last. The 15-minute drive to Maplewood Secondary felt like hours. As he turned onto the school's main drive, an unexpected sight made him brake hard. A crowd of at least 50 students had gathered on the front lawn. They held handmade signs with messages like "Stop Racism Now" and "Justice for Layla." Some students were still adding to their posters, marker squeaks audible even through his closed car windows. Jamal parked haphazardly and stepped out into the afternoon sun. The protesters noticed him immediately. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah Johnson, Layla's friend, rushed over. Her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was strong. "We're not letting them sweep this under the rug. What Professor Williams did was assault." Other students crowded around him, their voices overlapping as they tried to explain what had happened. Jamal caught fragments, burned her hair, said it wasn't artistic. "We got it on video." A tall boy, Michael Thompson, Jamal remembered him from the school's debate team, pushed forward with his phone. "Sir, I recorded right after it happened. You need to see this." The shaky video showed Layla clutching her hair, students rising in protest, and Margaret Williams standing with an electric candle, her face a mask of disdain. Jamal's hands began to shake. "Has anyone called the police?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "The administration said they're handling it internally," Emma Rodriguez answered, disgust clear in her tone. "They're trying to protect her." More students approached, each with their own story. A Muslim girl described how Margaret had called her hijab distracting last semester. A Latino boy mentioned being told his Spanish-inspired artwork was too ethnic for the spring showcase. "She's been doing this for years," Dylan Martinez explained, his hands clenched into fists. "But no one ever had proof before. Now we do." Jamal looked at these students, children from every background, united in their outrage, and felt a complicated mix of pride and fury. Pride in their solidarity, fury that it had taken his daughter's humiliation to bring this to light. "We're planning a proper protest," Sarah said, showing him their hastily created social media page. "Parents, community leaders, maybe even local news. We won't let them ignore this." Jamal nodded slowly, his mind already racing with strategies. As owner of the school, he had more power than these students knew. But first, he needed to see his daughter. "Keep documenting everything," he told the gathered students. "I'm going to handle this, but I need your help. This isn't just about today. It's about making sure nothing like this ever happens again." The students nodded, their expressions determined. As Jamal walked toward the school entrance, he heard them beginning to organize shifts for the protest, discussing social media strategies, and planning outreach to other parents. The Bell Street Cafe hummed with afternoon activity, but the corner booth where Layla sat with her friends felt like an island of tension. Her untouched chai latte had gone cold, condensation beating on the ceramic mug. Sarah, Emma, and Jade sat close, forming a protective circle around their friend. "I still can't believe she actually did that," Jade said, absently stirring her coffee. "Like, we all knew Williams was racist, but this crossed every line." Layla touched the damaged braid again, feeling the brittle texture where the flame had touched it. The physical damage was minor, just a small section of synthetic hair burned, but the weight of the humiliation still pressed on her chest. "My mom knows this amazing hairstylist," Emma offered, reaching across the table to squeeze Layla's hand. "She can fix the braid this weekend, make it even better than before." "That's not the point," Layla said, finally looking up from her drink. Her voice was quiet but steady. "These braids, they're not just a hairstyle. My grandmother taught me about them when I was little. Each pattern tells a story, carries history. Williams didn't just attack my hair. She tried to erase part of who I am." Sarah pulled out her phone, showing Layla the social media response to the incident. "Look at this, over 2,000 shares already. People are furious. The hashtag Justice for Layla is trending locally. My cousin at Roosevelt High says their Black Student Union is organizing a solidarity protest," Jade added. "This is bigger than just Maplewood now." Layla scrolled through the posts, seeing faces she recognized mixed with strangers, all expressing outrage and support. Something shifted in her chest, the heavy weight of shame beginning to transform into something else, something stronger. She pulled her sketchbook from her backpack, flipping to a clean page. Her hands moved quickly across the paper, rough lines taking shape. Her friends leaned in, watching as the drawing emerged. "It's a mural," Layla explained, adding details as she spoke. "See, here are traditional African braiding patterns, but they morph into other cultural symbols. Mexican sugar skulls, Chinese dragons, Islamic geometric patterns. Everything flowing together, showing how our differences make us stronger." "This is gorgeous," Emma breathed, pointing to a section of the sketch. "The way the braids become branches, connecting everything. We should paint this on the wall facing the school entrance," Sarah said, excitement building in her voice. "Make it huge, impossible to ignore. Show everyone what real art looks like." "You think they'll let us?" Jade asked skeptically. "They won't have a choice," Layla replied, adding final touches to the sketch. "My dad owns the building. And after what happened?" She paused, a small smile forming. "Well, I think he'll support this kind of artistic expression." The girls spent the next hour planning, their drinks forgotten as they listed supplies they'd need, calculated dimensions, and discussed color schemes. Other students from Maplewood began filtering into the cafe, drawn by social media posts about their location. Soon, their corner booth had become an impromptu command center. "We need to document the whole process," a sophomore named Marcus suggested, holding up his camera. "Make it a statement about creation versus destruction." "My aunt works for the local news," another student offered. "She'd love to cover this." Layla looked around at the growing crowd, all these people rallying around her pain and transforming it into something powerful. The burning shame that had driven her from the classroom was being replaced by determination, by purpose. "Williams wanted to teach me about true artistic expression," Layla said, standing up to better address the group. "So let's show her. Let's show everyone what happens when we embrace our different CS instead of trying to burn them away." A cheer went up from the gathered students. Someone started a group chat to coordinate supplies and schedules. Another person began sketching out a social media strategy. The energy in the cafe was electric, charged with possibility and purpose. As Layla watched her small act of resistance transform into a movement, she felt something settle inside her. Williams had tried to make her feel small, tried to make her doubt the beauty of her heritage. Instead, she'd sparked a fire that was spreading far beyond one classroom, one school, one incident. The administrative conference room of Maplewood Secondary felt smaller than usual as Jamal Thompson sat, facing the school's leadership team. Vice Principal Chun, Dean Roberts, and 3 board members occupied the other side of the polished oak table. The empty chair at the head, Principal Warner's usual seat, spoke volumes about priorities. "Where's Warner?" Jamal asked, his voice cutting through the artificial pleasantries. He'd placed his phone on the table, voice recorder running openly. The administrators exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Principal Warner had a prior engagement," Chin began, shuffling papers nervously. "But I assure you, we take this situation very seriously seriously enough that the principal couldn't cancel a meeting when a teacher assaulted a student." Jamal interrupted, pulling out a tablet. "Let me show you what serious looks like." He projected a series of statistics onto the wall. National data on discrimination in schools, incident reports from other districts, legal precedents involving teacher misconduct. Each slide landed like a hammer blow. "In the past 5 years," Jamal continued, advancing through his presentation, "minority students at Maplewood have reported 37 incidents of discriminatory behavior. 22 involved Professor Williams. 0 resulted in disciplinary action." Dean Roberts leaned forward, his face flushed. "Now, Mr. Thompson, those incidents were thoroughly investigated by whom?" Jamal demanded. "The same administration that's trying to handle this internally instead of filing a police report about an assault on a minor. We believe in restorative justice approaches," Chin interjected, reaching for a prepared statement. "Professor Williams has agreed to attend sensitivity training." Jamal's laugh was sharp enough to make them flinch. Sensitivity training? She burned my daughter's hair. She physically attacked a student because she didn't approve of her cultural expression. And you think some workshops will fix this? He pulled up another document, the school's liability insurance policy. I've highlighted some interesting sections about negligent retention of employees with documented discriminatory behavior. My lawyers found it fascinating reading. The board members whispered among themselves, their faces growing increasingly concerned. Jamal watched them calculate risks, weigh costs, consider headlines. He could practically see dollar signs reflecting in their eyes. "What exactly are you proposing?" asked board member Phillips, speaking for the first time. Jamal slid a folder across the table. "A comprehensive plan for a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. Mandatory anti-bias training for all staff. Real training, not just online modules. Regular cultural competency assessments. An immediate suspension of Professor Williams pending a full investigation." "That's quite extensive," Chin hedged. "The budget implications alone are less than a discrimination lawsuit," Jamal finished. "Much less than the publicity damage when the media picks up this story. And they will pick it up. There are already reporters asking questions." The administrators huddled together, speaking in urgent whispers. Jamal watched them, remembering Layla's tears, the burn mark on her braid, the students protesting outside. His patience was wearing thin. "We'll need time to review these proposals," Roberts finally said. "Perhaps we could reconvene next week." "No." Jamal stood, gathering his materials. "You have until tomorrow morning. After that, I start making calls to the police, to the media, to civil rights attorneys. Time's up on handling things internally." "Mr. Thompson," Chin called as Jamal reached the door. "Please understand our position. Change takes time. My daughter didn't have time when Williams was burning her hair." Jamal replied without turning around. "The students protesting outside don't have time. This stops now, with or without your cooperation." As he walked away, he could hear the panic in their voices as they realized he wasn't bluffing. But their fear, their scrambling, their empty promises, none of it was enough. Not anymore. Jamal pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. If the administration wouldn't act, he had other cards to play. Sometimes you had to tear down the old system to build something better. The community center's main hall buzzed with energy as people filed in, filling every available seat. Parents, students, local activists, and community leaders packed the space, their voices creating a low rumble of shared purpose. Handmade signs leaned against chairs, and smartphones recorded everything, live streaming to those who couldn't attend. Maria Rodriguez, Emma's mother and local council member, stood at the podium, bringing order to the charged atmosphere. "We're here tonight because our children deserve better," she began, her voice firm. "What happened to Layla Thompson isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a deeper problem." Parents began standing up, sharing stories that had previously gone untold. A Somali mother described her son being discouraged from joining advanced placement classes despite his high grades. A Korean father talked about his daughter being told to tone down her cultural celebrations for a school project. "My son was told his Spanish was disruptive in the hallways," said Carlos Martinez, his hands gripping the microphone tightly. "These aren't just microaggressions. They're systematic erasure of our identities." Each story built upon the last, creating a devastating picture of institutional bias. The room grew heavier with shared pain, but also with growing determination. This wasn't just anger anymore. It was a movement taking shape. Jamal watched from the side of the stage, noting faces, recording names, building mental lists of allies and resources. When he finally stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. "I've spent the last 2 days listening to administration promises," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "They offer workshops, sensitivity training, internal reviews, but they're missing the point. This isn't about fixing a few bad attitudes. It's about dismantling a system that allowed those attitudes to flourish." He projected images onto the wall behind him. Statistics, incident reports, student testimonies. Maplewood has a choice to make. They can either be part of the solution, or they can become an example of what happens when institutions refuse to change. The crowd murmured in agreement. Phones raised higher, capturing every word. But we're not just here to complain, Jamal continued, his voice gaining strength. We're here to act. I'm announcing the formation of a community oversight committee for educational equity. We'll monitor school policies, review hiring practices, and ensure that every student's culture is respected and celebrated. Sarah's mother, Dr. Johnson, a professor of education at the local university, stood up. I'm offering to lead cultural competency workshops, real ones, not just checkbox exercises. And we'll document everything, create a model other schools can follow. More parents joined in, offering resources, expertise, connections. A local civil rights attorney volunteered pro bono services. A mental health counselor offered trauma support for affected students. The individual threads of outrage were weaving into a tapestry of action. This isn't just about punishment, Jamal emphasized, looking around the room. It's about transformation. Our children shouldn't have to fight for respect. They shouldn't have to defend their identity. They shouldn't have to prove their worth. He paused, letting his words sink in. But until that day comes, we will stand with them. We will fight with them. And we will win with them. The room erupted in applause. Parents began signing up for committee positions, exchanging contact information, forming working groups. The energy had shifted from angry protest to focused determination. As the meeting wound down, smaller groups formed, planning next steps. Jamal moved between them, listening, connecting people, building the coalition he knew they'd need. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about creating lasting change. A local news crew had arrived, setting up for interviews. Social media buzzed with updates. What had started as one teacher's act of discrimination was becoming a catalyst for systemic reform. The morning sun cast long shadows across the school's east wall as Layla and her team of student artists began their work. Drop cloths covered the ground, paint cans stood in neat rows, and detailed sketches were taped up for reference. The blank wall loomed before them, a canvas waiting to tell their story. Grid systems marked. Marcus called out, stepping back from the wall where he'd drawn light pencil lines. Ready for the base coat whenever you are. Layla nodded, double-checking her original design. The sketch had evolved over several days of collaboration, incorporating suggestions from students of different backgrounds. What had started as her personal statement had grown into something larger, more inclusive. Start with the center, she directed, pointing to where the main braid pattern would begin. That's our anchor point. Everything else flows from there. Students worked in teams, some rolling on base colors while others began sketching the larger elements. The pattern of braids emerged first, intricate and powerful, transforming into branches that reached across the wall. From these branches, cultural symbols bloomed. Japanese cherry blossoms melted into Arabic calligraphy, which flowed into Aztec patterns, then merged with African tribal designs. Look at this, Emma said, stepping back from her section where Chinese dragons danced through the braided branches. It's like each piece makes the others stronger. The morning progressed, and more students arrived to help. Some brought refreshments, others documented the process with photos and videos. The mural grew steadily, each hour adding layers of depth and meaning. Around mid-morning, Layla noticed movement in her peripheral vision. Through the art room windows, Professor Margaret Williams stood watching. Her face was partially hidden behind a curtain, but her presence was unmistakable. Sarah noticed too. Want me to tell her to leave? She asked, protective anger evident in her voice. No, Layla replied, not pausing in her work. Let her watch. Let her see what real artistic expression looks like. But Margaret didn't leave. She remained at the window, observing as the mural took shape. Her expression shifted between confusion, discomfort, and something harder to read, perhaps recognition. After an hour of watching, Margaret emerged from the building. She walked slowly toward the group of painters, her heels clicking on the concrete. The students tensed, some moving protectively closer to Layla. Miss Thompson, Margaret began, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. If you're here to criticize our work, Emma interrupted, save it. We have permits and approval for this project. Margaret flinched at the hostility, but stood her ground. Actually, I wanted to see it up close. The technique is quite. She trailed off, seeming to struggle with the words. Layla set down her brush and and turned to face her teacher fully. The woman who had seemed so intimidating in the classroom now looked smaller, uncertain. But Layla didn't feel satisfaction in that uncertainty, only a tired sort of clarity. You wanted to see real art? Layla gestured to the wall. This is real art. Every line, every symbol, every color represents someone's story, someone's identity, someone's truth. You can't burn this away. The students had stopped painting, watching the confrontation unfold. Margaret looked at the mural, then back at Layla, opening her mouth to speak. Save it. Layla cut her off, picking up her brush again. If you want to understand, really understand, then stop talking and start listening. Watch how these different styles and symbols come together. See how nothing has to be erased for everything to work together. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Layla turned back to her work, dismissing Margaret's presence. One by one, the other students did the same, returning to their painting. Margaret stood there for another moment, then walked away, her footsteps fading into the morning buzz of the school. But the energy she'd brought with her lingered, pushing Layla and her team to work with even greater purpose. Late afternoon sunlight slanted across the school courtyard as Layla stood face to face with Margaret Williams. The confrontation they'd both been avoiding had finally arrived, with students gathering at a careful distance, phones discreetly recording. You wanted to talk? Layla said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. So talk. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, her usual classroom authority stripped away by the setting and circumstances. I wanted to explain my actions that day, she began, her hands nervously adjusting her sleeve. I was trying to teach an important lesson about Dash. About what? Layla interrupted, taking a step forward. About how my culture doesn't meet your definition of art. About how you have the right to physically assault a student because you don't like their appearance? That's not. I didn't mean to. Margaret's composure cracked slightly. You have to understand, I've been teaching art for 23 years. There are standards, traditions, Dash. Whose traditions? Layla's voice rose slightly, drawing more onlookers. My braids are part of a tradition that goes back centuries. Each pattern tells a story, carries meaning. Did you ever once ask what they meant to me? Did you ever think about why I wear them? Students had formed a loose circle around them now. Sarah and Emma stood closest to Layla, ready to intervene if needed. The tension in the air was palpable. I admit I may have overreacted, Margaret said, her words careful and measured. The candle was inappropriate, and I regret Dash. Overreacted? Layla let out a sharp laugh. You burned my hair. You tried to destroy something that's part of my identity. And you're standing here talking about overreacting like you spilled paint on my homework. Margaret's face flushed. Now see here, young lady. I'm still your teacher, and Dash. No, Layla cut in, her voice ice cold. You're not. You lost the right to call yourself my teacher the moment you decided your prejudices were more important than your students' humanity. The gathered crowd murmured in agreement. Margaret glanced around, seemingly noticing for the first time how many witnesses were present. I've apologized, she said, an edge of desperation creeping into her voice. What more do you want from me? An apology? Layla shook her head. I don't want your apology. I want you to understand what you did. Really understand. Look at me, Professor Williams. Look at my braids, my skin, my culture. Are you seeing a problem to be fixed? Or are you finally seeing a person? Margaret stood silent, her usual defensive posture crumbling slightly. For the first time, uncertainty showed clearly on her face. You know what the worst part is? Layla continued, her voice softening, but no less intense. You're an art teacher. You're supposed to help students find their voice, express their truth. Instead, you've been teaching them that some voices matter more than others, that some truths are more acceptable. Tears welled in Margaret's eyes, but she blinked them back. I never meant. I was trying to maintain standards. Your standards are the problem, Layla said firmly. They're not universal truths. They're just another form of control. And I'm done letting you control my expression. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. The silence stretched between them, heavy with decades of unexamined bias meeting raw, uncompromising truth. Finally, Margaret turned away, her shoulders slumped in defeat. But Layla wasn't finished. "Professor Williams," she called after her, "next time you look at art, any art, ask yourself, are you judging it by its power to speak truth, or by its ability to fit your comfortable assumptions?" Margaret paused but didn't turn around. After a moment, she continued walking, disappearing into the school building. The gathered students began to disperse, many approaching Layla with words of support and admiration. But Layla barely heard them. She stood watching the door where Margaret had vanished, feeling neither victory nor satisfaction. Only a quiet, determined certainty that this conversation was just the beginning of a much larger change. The morning of the protest dawned bright and clear. By 8 a.m., the school grounds had transformed into a sea of people and signs. Students, parents, and community members filled every available space, their energy electric with purpose. News vans lined the street, cameras capturing the growing crowd. The mural on the east wall served as a backdrop, its colors vibrant in the morning light. Students had strung lights around it the night before, ensuring it would remain visible even after sunset. The braided patterns seemed to move in the shifting light, telling their story of unity and resistance. Jamal stood on the makeshift stage, surveying the crowd. Local civil rights leaders flanked him, along with representatives from various cultural organizations. Dr. Johnson had just finished explaining the new educational initiatives they developed. Now it was his turn. 3 weeks ago, he began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. A teacher at this school decided she had the right to physically attack a student because of her cultural expression. He paused, letting the words sink in. But that incident wasn't the disease. It was just a symptom. The crowd listened intently as Jamal laid out the years of documented discrimination, the ignored complaints, the systematic dismissal of cultural differences. Each point landed like a hammer blow, backed by data projected on a large screen behind him. "We're not here just because of one teacher's actions," he continued. "We're here because an entire system allowed those actions to happen, encouraged them, protected them." From her position near the stage, Layla watched her father speaking truth to power. She sat surrounded by friends and supporters, all wearing traditional hairstyles from various cultures in solidarity. The sight would have brought tears to her eyes if she hadn't already cried them all out days ago. But today, Jamal's voice rose with conviction. "We're doing more than just protesting. We're showing what real change looks like." He gestured to the mural. "Look at that wall. Look at how different cultural elements flow together, support each other, create something beautiful. That's not just art. It's a blueprint for our future." The crowd erupted in cheers. Signs waved, phones recorded, social media buzzed with real-time updates. Local news reporters scribbled frantically in their notepads. "We demand immediate action," Jamal announced, pulling out a docu. Meant a complete overhaul of cultural sensitivity training. Diverse eating practices. Student-led cultural committees with real power. And yes, accountability for those who abuse their positions of authority. Through the art room window, Margaret Williams watched the proceedings. Her face showed a complex mix of emotions, defensiveness, fear, and perhaps a dawning recognition of the magnitude of what she'd sparked. She clutched her purse tightly, looking increasingly isolated in the empty classroom. "This isn't just about punishment," Jamal emphasized, his voice softening slightly. "It's about transformation, about creating a space where every student can be fully, proudly themselves. Where diversity isn't just tolerated, it's celebrated." He unveiled the plans for the new Diversity and Inclusion Center to be built on campus. The architectural renderings showed a space designed to showcase different cultures, host community events, and provide resources for cultural education. "The funding is secured," he announced. "The plans are approved. Construction begins next month." This isn't a promise. It's happening. The crowd's reaction was deafening. Students hugged, parents wiped away tears, reporters rushed to get statements. The energy of possibility filled the air. As Jamal concluded his speech, students began unveiling their own initiatives. Mentorship programs, cultural exchange events, art exhibitions celebrating diversity. What had started as a response to discrimination had evolved into a movement for positive change. Margaret still watched from her window, but now she seemed smaller, diminished by the tide of progress flowing around her. Her expression suggested she finally understood that she wasn't just facing disciplinary action. She was watching her entire worldview become obsolete. The school board's emergency meeting room felt like a pressure cooker. Board members sat behind their elevated desk, shifting uncomfortably as Margaret Williams faced them from the witness chair. The room was packed with administrators, teachers, and legal representatives. Security guards stood at the doors, a testament to the tension surrounding the proceedings. "Professor Williams," Board President Hamilton began, "you've had time to reflect on your actions. Do you understand why we're here today?" Margaret straightened in her chair, her trademark confidence visibly strained. "I believe this situation has been blown out of proportion," she said, her voice tight. "What happened with Miss Thompson was unfortunate, but unfortunate." Jamal interrupted from his seat at the legal counsel table. He pressed a button on his laptop, and audio filled the room. Margaret's voice from previous faculty meetings, making dismissive comments about cultural expressions, defending her traditional teaching methods. The color drained from Margaret's face as her own words echoed through the room. More recordings followed, conversations with other teachers, comments to students, a pattern of bias laid bare in her own voice. "Where did you get those?" she demanded, half rising from her chair. "Teachers who couldn't stay silent anymore," Jamal replied calmly. "Students who finally felt safe enough to come forward. You've been recording your own downfall for years, Professor Williams. We just compiled it." The board members exchanged glances. This was more than they'd expected, more than a single incident they could smooth over with sensitivity training and a reprimand. "This is a witch hunt," Margaret protested, looking desperately at her colleagues. "You all know me. 23 years of service to this school. My students have won awards. Your white students have won awards," Jamal corrected, pulling up more data. "Looking at your grading history, students of color in your classes consistently received lower marks for artistic expression and creativity. Care to explain that pattern?" Margaret's lawyer leaned forward to whisper in her ear. "Beauty," she brushed him off. "Art has standards," she insisted, her voice rising. "Universal principles that transcend cultural. Universal according to whom?" Jamal demanded. He projected images onto the wall. Ancient African art, Asian masterpieces, indigenous creations. "Are you saying these aren't art? That they don't meet your universal standards?" Sweat beaded on Margaret's forehead. "You're twisting my words. I've always encouraged diversity. By burning it away?" Jamal's voice cut like steel. He played the video from the classroom incident. The sound of Layla's scream made several board members flinch. Margaret's composure cracked. "It was just a demonstration. I was trying to teach. To teach what? That difference must be destroyed? That conformity is more important than creativity? That your narrow view of art is worth assaulting a student?" The room fell silent except for Margaret's rapid breathing. She looked around wildly, finding no allies among her former supporters. The evidence was too clear, the pattern too obvious to deny. I didn't mean," she stammered, her authority finally crumbling completely. "Things were different when I started teaching. The standards were the standards were wrong," Jamal said firmly. "And your inability to recognize that, to grow and change with the times, brings us here today." Margaret's lawyer tried again to intervene, but she pushed him away, standing up suddenly. "You can't erase 23 years of dedication over one mistake. This is my life's work." "No one's erasing anything," Jamal replied. "We're just finally seeing it clearly. Every discriminatory comment, every biased grade, every student you made feel less than, it's all preserved. The question is, what will the board do about it?" The board members huddled together, speaking in urgent whispers. Margaret stood trembling, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. The evidence against her wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was about a career-long pattern of bias finally exposed to the light. The following morning, news vans crowded the school parking lot as students arrived. Local stations interrupted their regular programming to broadcast Jamal's press conference live from the school steps. Behind him, The diversity mural served as a powerful backdrop, its intertwined cultural symbols gleaming in the morning light. Last night, the school board reviewed extensive evidence of systematic discrimination within our arts program. Jamal began, his voice steady and clear. Today, I can announce that Professor Margaret Williams has been terminated from her position at Maplewood Secondary, effective immediately. Camera flashes erupted as reporters scribbled frantically. Through the art room window, Margaret could be seen packing her supplies into cardboard boxes, supervised by school security. Her movements were mechanical, her face blank with shock. But this isn't just about one teacher's dismissal, Jamal continued, pulling out a USB drive. This drive contains over 50 hours of recorded discriminatory incidents, biased grading patterns, and systematic suppression of cultural expression. As of this morning, copies have been sent to the Department of Education's Civil Rights Office and major media outlets nationwide. The crowd gasped. Margaret, visible through the window, froze in her packing. This wasn't just a local scandal anymore. It was about to become a national conversation. Maplewood Secondary is implementing immediate changes, Jamal announced, gesturing to the new committee members standing behind him. I've accepted the board's invitation to chair the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Our first action will be a complete audit of all departments, looking for similar patterns of discrimination. He outlined the new initiatives: mandatory cultural competency training designed by actual diversity experts, regular reviews of grading patterns for bias, student-led cultural comment, EES with real power, and a complete overhaul of the arts curriculum to include global perspectives. Inside the building, Margaret finally finished packing. As she walked down the hallway for the last time, students lined the walls in silent witness. No one spoke. No one moved. Their presence alone was statement enough. When she reached the exit, Layla stood waiting. "Professor Williams," Layla said quietly, "I hope you finally understand what we've been trying to teach you." Margaret paused, looking at her former student. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Now she was the one being taught a lesson. Without responding, she pushed through the doors into the glare of camera lights and shouted questions from reporters. Back at the podium, Jamal was concluding his announcement. This isn't the end, it's a beginning. What happened here at Maplewood is happening in schools across the country. But today, we're showing that change is possible. That students don't have to accept discrimination. That their voices matter. That their cultures matter. He gestured to the mural, where students had gathered in solidarity. Look at this artwork. Really look at it. See how these different cultural elements don't fight each other. They enhance each other. They create something stronger, more beautiful together than any could be alone. That's not just art. That's the future we're building. The crowd erupted in applause. Social media exploded with supportive messages from across the country. Other schools began reaching out, asking for guidance on implementing similar changes. Layla stood with her friends, watching her father field questions from reporters. The damaged braid had long since been repaired, but she kept a small piece of the burned hair in a jar on her desk. A reminder not of pain, but of power. Of how one act of discrimination had sparked a movement for change. As the morning progressed, students began returning to classes. Not the same students who had witnessed the burning of a braid weeks ago, but stronger, more aware, more determined to stand up for each other. The mural watched over them, its intertwined symbols of culture and identity telling a new story. One of resistance, unity, and transformation. In her empty classroom, Margaret's name had already been removed from the door. Through the window, the sound of celebration continued, marking not just her departure, but the arrival of something new, a future where every student's culture could flourish, where art meant freedom of expression, not conformity to one person's standards. The revolution that began with a burning braid had transformed into a beacon of hope, lighting the way for others to follow.